Hi, everybody. Welcome. So today we're going to be speaking with Lisa Falco, who has just published her fantastic book, and I'm so excited to talk a little bit more about it with you. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Amazing. So I guess it would be great if you start off by talking a little bit about the book and your motivation for writing it.
Yes, of course. So I was previously working in a startup here in Switzerland called Ava Women, where we were developing a bracelet to find the fertile window in the menstrual cycle and helping women that wanted to get pregnant. And I was director of data science there and was in charge of developing the algorithms that took all this data to find the best time to try to conceive. And I thought it was so interesting how the body functioned, how fascinating it was, how big influence the hormones had on our physiology. I mean, the hormones were driving changes in heartbeat, in temperature, in breathing rate, and so many other aspects of our bodies. It was just so fascinating to me. And at the same time, since it was a startup, we needed to help a bit everywhere. So I was also spending quite a lot of time in customer support and in the different user communities, talking directly to women that tried to get pregnant. And it became so obvious to me how little these women knew about their own bodies. And to be honest, I also had many things that I didn't know before starting at Ava and before, really digging into this research. And I realized there was really a huge gap in knowledge. And after almost 5 years at Ava, very, very hectic startup page, I needed a break. And I had found back to an old passion of writing and storytelling when I was doing my TED Talk. I took some time off to completely geek out about the female body, digging really deep to understand how all these different parts of the body interacted with each other, and then write a book about it, and hopefully really to empower women to learn more about their bodies.
Yeah, I feel like you're talking about this gap. There is such a gap in knowledge, and I think we just don't know enough about how hormones have affected or affect the female body, because it just hasn't been researched or looked into. So I found out recently that your voice can change depending on where you are in your menstrual cycle, because the role that hormones play, which I think was so fascinating. And I wonder, are there a couple of interesting facts that you found from your research that really stand out for you, or that just made you go, wow, that's so incredible?
There were so many. I mean, as you say, I think that all these basic influences of the hormones are really interesting. And as you say, that we have receptors everywhere. You talked about, the voice, but also the eyes have receptors for progesterone. So it relaxes, that changes the lens. So your vision changes, which is also why you should never get new glasses when you're pregnant, unless you want to change them afterwards again. So, there's basic effects that estrogen, for instance, it influences the blood flow and the serotonin levels, which is also why you're happier in the high estrogen phases, and you get the PMS when it's gone. And then you have progesterone, which really leads, to general relaxation, but also a relaxation of the smooth muscles inside the body. So you can become constipated, for instance, in the second half of your menstrual cycle. I mean, these basic things makes you, when you know this, it kind of makes you think and discover other things yourself, It's it's just a general cool thing. And then one fact that I thought was really fascinating with regards to pregnancy is, of course, during pregnancy, all your hormones, the levels are so many times higher than the normal menstrual cycle. So all these effects, they blow up tenfold. But what I thought was really interesting, for instance, that the placenta is not your organ. The placenta is actually the organ of the baby, and it's the baby's way of controlling your body, and it's controlling your body to do all this transformation. And that is by releasing all these hormones. Again, that leads to the changes, that the belly grows, your breast grows, your voice changes a lot, the joints and everything comes, it relaxes. So actually the baby can come out and have enough space to grow.
That's incredible. I think it's, just not only during pregnancy, but throughout the whole menstrual cycle, your body is just constantly changing because of the influence that these hormones have. And I guess, you're talking like, I didn't know half of those things that you've just said. Why do you think that there's such a gap in that information, or that the everyday person would be like, wow, I never knew that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things known. There is a lot of research happening. And why is that? I mean, a lot of things we actually do know and that we do learn in school, but maybe it's too early to learn these things in school. My daughter, she learned this when she was 12 in school, but she won't make any use of it for another 10 years. So by the time she'll be interested, then, she has forgotten most of it. And then I think it's a lot of having these popular science writers, maybe, that take the science from the lab and from the research papers, which are very difficult to access and to really understand, and that to take them to the general public. That's maybe what's lacking, and that's a little bit what my book wants to do, to bring everything that's out there. Yes, there's a gap in what has been researched, but a lot of the research has simply not reached the large audience. And I think for me, it was good also to do it in forms of a book, because you can explain more nuances and so on, and explain a little bit what clinical research is, because it only hits the media if it's provocative or really bad, and if it gives you an extreme headline. But this really useful information that is useful for an individual, and it's not so extreme, and it's not life-threatening. It's just normal, and that's not newsworthy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the whole gap that I'm hoping to cover with the book, and I hope also many more will cover. And I think Femtech is also playing an important role there in educating on the normal things, and not only the extreme and life-threatening or things.
Yeah, I really feel like Femtech's definitely opening the kind of access gap. Exactly what you're saying. A lot of women won't be able to kind of read and understand those really scientific documents. So it's great that there's a lot of content coming out now that's trying to fill that gap. In your book, did you feel like, I think in the Femtech community, there's a lot of conversation around the fact that there's big gaps in research between men and women, because like hormones are seen as chaotic and unresearchable. Did you find that a lot in your book, or not at all?
Oh yes, I mean, definitely there's a big difference. I mean, it's also driven by the hormones, and also I think especially when you talk, it's important to point out that when you talk about gender differences, there is a very big difference on average. But average, all the results on how we are, it's always a big distribution. So you can be, on a quite large spectrum on this distribution on what is normal. And there's a lot of this normal spectra for both men and women that overlap. Mm-hmm. So there are also a lot of similarities between men and women, but they're also, like, on average, are quite big differences. And it's driven by the hormones as well. So estrogen, for instance, it gives us more fat, so we have a higher percentage of fat than men, and also that the fat rather goes towards the hips and the thighs, whereas testosterone, on the other hand, is more prominent in building muscles. But men also have estrogen and women also have testosterone. So it's not, it's not the clear cut division. I think that's really important to bear in mind as well. And also you have brain structure. The brain structure is also influenced by the hormones. And for instance, estrogen stimulates the connections between the two hemispheres. So on average, I mean, not for everyone, but on average, women have better connections between the two hemispheres in the brain that men has. That you can draw some conclusions from if you like. But again, on average, and it's never enough, to say this is valid for all women and this is valid for all men.
Yeah.
Then you have some important stuff as well in medical research, for instance, that women's kidneys take much longer to get rid of substances, to clear substances from the blood. And this is very important, for instance, when you test drugs and decide how much of a certain drug you should take. It's not only about weight. It also depends, on how much fat you have and your kidney function. And things like this are important to take into account. And nowadays it's also mandatory to do so, but only, I don't know, it hasn't been mandatory for very long. Now I can't remember the exact dates, but we're talking about a decade or two. So there's a lot of positive things happening. It can be positive about the future, but there's still some work to go.
Definitely. I remember I read when I read the date for like it being mandated that you had to also test on female bodies, I was very shocked. It was very recent, definitely within the last couple of decades. That's like, I feel like this is kind of a Bible to the women's body, like to understand how your body is different from male bodies, but also like almost the power that it gives us. If there was like one thing that you would want every woman to know about their body, or just feel about their body, what would it be?
It's I guess it's basic influence of the hormones, but also realize that the hormones always generate these chain effects along something they call the HBO axis, which is from the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and the ovaries. And this is also how this cyclicity, how our reproductive system is communicating with the outside world, because the hypothalamus is in the brain. And this is also being influenced by external factors such as stress and what we eat and so on. So you really can have a true influence on your menstrual cycle with, from external factors, and that actually has an influence on your health, because the estrogen, it improves your bone quality, it protects you against dementia and all this. So you actually should care about having this more or less in order. I think that's maybe a good message to take home.
A really good message. And I think, I think it's really undervalued how important estrogen and progesterone are to kind of the whole functioning of the body. Do you think that that's what like makes male and female bodies so different, or are there other factors within that?
I mean, a lot of the differences are secondary effects of the hormones. So yes, it's of course not the only one. I mean, some differences are really the fact that we have a better immune system, for instance, than men on average. That's more linked to the chromosomes and not really to the hormones. So there are other aspects that are not driven by that, but really I would say the vast majority of the differences is hormonal.
Hormone related. That's so interesting. I want to if you don't mind, touch on kind of 3 things that you said that I found really interesting, and maybe talk about them a little more. So what you just said about the immune system, I think is really fascinating. Can you say any more on that?
Yes, it's very general. Well, it's been actually seen in COVID as well. So men tended, at least in the beginning of epidemic, maybe I should be careful about saying this because I haven't followed up recently on what this looks like. But the fact that we have a better immune system than the men, it actually makes us ill more often, because a lot of our illness is actually a symptom of our immune system that is reacting to an invasive virus. Mm-hmm. But whereas maybe in men, the virus can come in and do more harm, whereas women are much more frequently ill. And of course, also the fact that we have a stronger immune system, this negative side effect of that is that we have more autoimmune diseases. That's really a huge difference between men and women. Some of them, I think it's lupus and even MS. I think it's like 80% women. So it's really a big difference.
Yeah, it's huge. I've been reading a lot about autoimmune disease, and it's really, really prevalent amongst female population. But then I feel like a lot of medicine is trialed on a specific type of male body, so it can often be difficult to treat. And then another thing you mentioned was around the brain being structured slightly different, and I'd love to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Yes, it's always a bit tricky to talk about, right? Because you don't want to impose that one gender is like this and the other. But a lot of the typical things, like when you have prejudice about men are like this and women are like that, it can to some extent be triggered by those differences. And this what can I say about that? It's a bit hard.
It's okay.
Yeah. This that we are better connected between the left and the right hemisphere is something I actually seen on myself. I was researching, my PhD was about brain imaging. Mm-hmm. So I was working on methods to show the connectivity within the brain. And I was sharing office with a guy, and we had so little images to work with, so we always had to jump into the MRI scanner and scan our brains. And we actually very quickly saw that I had much better connections between the two hemispheres than he had. And of course, then we were pulling a lot of conclusions about this, but I can't say to what extent they were scientifically relevant. But he was always very concentrated, always focusing on work, whereas I had more tendency to combine my work with a lot of social activities and jump back and forth like this. But I wouldn't,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. This is not entirely scientifically backed up, I guess.
It's really interesting, nevertheless. And then the final one is around the eyes relaxing. So are you able to see differently, or a little more different around different points of your menstrual cycle? Like, what does that mean?
Yes. I mean, it does mean that you have a slightly different eyesight in the mid-luteal phase. So the luteal phase is the second phase of the menstrual cycle, and progesterone is peaking around, in the middle of that. So that's 3/4 into the menstrual cycle. There you can spot a slight difference. It won't be so different that you can't use the same glasses or so on, but it is a measurable difference for sure. When you're pregnant, on the other hand, it really is a big difference. And I remember, actually, I think this is very well known with opticians. I walked in, terribly pregnant to the optician's office, and they basically told me to go home and forget about it until I delivered. That it simply wasn't worth it.
Wow. That is fascinating. Yeah, I feel like I've learned like so much. I guess, is there anything you really want people to know about the book, or a fact you want everybody to take away?
Well, about the book, I think I would like people to know that you shouldn't be scared of it, because it is very scientific. I mean, there's a lot of scientific facts, but I have taken a lot of effort to try to bring it in a really easy to read and easy to understand way. So even though, you know, it digs deep, it digs very deep. But the goal is that you shouldn't just understand the facts. You should get this kind of a framework to understand that when you're confronted to new facts, that you can more or less judge, does this make sense or does it not make sense? Because I think there's so much misinformation out there, and there are a lot of, you know, extreme headlines. But when you look a bit closer to the research, you can often, you know, yes, it is not incorrect what is the answer, but you can kind of tone it down a few notches and yeah, relativize a little bit. And I think to have this basic understanding, I think my book is quite good for that, and that you shouldn't be afraid of it.
I like that. Don't be afraid of it. And how is the book kind of structured for people who haven't read it?
So it's covering everything from puberty to menopause, and it also goes through pregnancy, everything that's happening in the body in all these different phases, which is quite big. Of course, there's a lot of information about the menstrual cycle, how it really works inside the body, and the effect that the menstrual cycle then has, all this unexpected impact of the hormones as well. And yeah, what happens in extreme cases in pregnancy, and when suddenly all of them disappears, which happens in menopause. That also, of course, you know, they have so many positive effects, and suddenly you don't have them anymore. And that transition can be quite rough for some, not for everyone. So you also don't need to be afraid before it doesn't have to be bad. But,
Amazing.
It also talks about fertility, of course, and contraception. What does it mean? I mean, it talks a lot about hormonal contraception, because hormonal contraception is a conscious disruption of this hormonal balance. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be both positive and negative, and it explores a little bit those different aspects.
I like that. So don't be afraid of the book, and don't be afraid of menopause. neither will be so bad.
Generally, don't be afraid, I would say.
I really
it's interesting. It's interesting, but shouldn't be scary.
Yeah, and I feel like the more we can learn about our bodies, the more like tools and other things we can use to support our bodies. So, you know, maybe we would be better to decide what contraception is good for us, or when we need to rest more, or look after ourselves more. I don't know. I feel like there's so much power to unlock when you kind of understand it a lot better.